townsfolk drifted from panel to panel, examining landscapes, portraits, and the occasional still life with the fervour of those who had already settled their opinions in advance. Inspector Purbright, for once in plain clothes and unobserved by uniformed authority, lingered near a corner of the tea-room annex, where cups of mild, decidedly lukewarm tea were passed about in delicate china. He nursed a cup himself, noting that the cream had a slightly off-white tint that perhaps only a Purbright would consider relevant. It seemed to him that the tea reflected in miniature the character of the exhibition, pleasant, benign, and utterly ordinary so far. It was then that Mrs. Talloway, a formidable figure in Flaxborough's unofficial network of gossip, nudged her companion, Mr. Slater, and whispered something. Purbright's gaze, their gesture, small gathering, a group of children in school usually at the camera, yet tucked into the background, almost imperceptibly, trimmed moustache, a full ellipse. Him? I could swear on the vicar's nor denied. Different angles might resolve the identity, though he did so with a tremor of I assure you, Barrow's tone, otherwise mysterious, wandered back toward the hall entrance, nodding politely to acquaintances. The mayor, whose face was a permanent exercise in civic composure, intercepted him. "Inspector," he said, voice low, "do you think we should call the press?" Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "With respect, sir, I think it prudent to observe a little longer before inviting outside attention. Sometimes the most extraordinary events in Flaxborough are best understood at a gentle pace." And so the day settled into an uneasy rhythm. Townsfolk examining photographs, teacups clinking politely, and the photograph itself a trivial piece of paper, and yet, curiously, an object of whispered speculation, waiting silently to reveal its secrets. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between conversation and curiosity, Inspector Purbright sensed the first threads of a mystery that would demand not loud declarations but the patience of observation, the subtle reading of manner, and the gentle untangling of truth from polite fiction. It was, in the quiet way that Flaxborough afforded such things, a morning that promised disturbance. By the time the clock in St. Cuthbert's Tower struck noon, the tale of the photograph had grown, in the manner peculiar to Flaxborough, from a curious anomaly into a topic of subdued urgency. In the tea-room of Mrs. Talloway, the steam rising from cups of Earl Grey carried whispers that threaded from table to table. Every patron offered their own version of the story, each more elaborate than the last, and each asserting its particular claim to truth. Mrs. Talloway herself, naturally, insisted on emphasizing the resemblance of the man in the photograph to the late Mr. Aldridge, the retired bank manager, whose death, 11 years past, had been a quiet but widely acknowledged fact. "It is his moustache, I tell you, precisely," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the rim of her cup. No other man in Flaxborough wore one quite like that. She paused, as if the emphasis alone might persuade reality itself to bend. Across the room, Mr. Slater coughed delicately and offered a correction, couched in the tone of someone keen to maintain civility, despite inner disbelief. "Well, perhaps it is merely a likeness. Photographs can deceive. I mean, even the best lens can mislead the eye." The other patrons glanced his way, some nodding politely, others with expressions that suggested disagreement rooted more in principle than observation. Meanwhile, in the corner, a group of younger townsfolk leaned over a display of pressed ferns, arguing not about who the man might be, but about the possibility that the figure had, improbably, walked among them just days ago. "I saw him myself," one whispered, lowering his voice as though fear might lend credibility. "Near the old brewery? He looked just like this photograph." The declaration hung in the air, drawing curious glances that were equal parts amusement and unease. At the vicarage, the Reverend Godwin received a polite but urgent note from a concerned parishioner. His response, measured and deliberate, reminded the writer that appearances could deceive and that the soul's proper concern lay in matters of faith rather than photographic trickery. Yet even as he composed his letter, he felt a subtle tremor of curiosity, a feeling he had not experienced since the day of the last church fete scandal. Across the street, Mr. Darrow, the photographer, took his midday tea alone, his hands slightly tremulous. He had been polite enough to display his work publicly, yet the insinuations that accompanied it now made him reconsider even the act of exhibition. He mused over the quiet suggestion that someone might question not only the authenticity of the photograph, but also the circumstances of its development. Nothing had been amiss, he told himself firmly, but the town's imagination could render even the most mundane truth into a tale of intrigue. It was in these quiet reactions that Purbright found the true measure of the situation. He observed the way Mrs. Talloway's brow creased when she recounted her certainty, how Mr. Slater's corrections carried more defensiveness than conviction, and how the inspector was particularly attentive to the timing of remarks, the subtle pauses, and the gentle hesitations that punctuated otherwise ordinary conversation. These, he understood, were the threads from which the tapestry of truth might eventually be drawn. By mid-afternoon, gossip had seeped into the bookshop and the general store, where Miss Hayworth, the assistant, found herself repeatedly asked if she had, in her own sight, glimpsed a man long supposed absent. Her answers, careful and courteous, varied according to her assessment of the questioner's credulity. Some she appeased with cautious affirmation, others she redirected with a neutral observation about the photograph's composition. Still the story gained momentum, each retelling, refining, distorting, and embellishing, until the once innocuous snapshot became a point of collective speculation. Even the town council found itself drawn into the quiet stir. At the daily administrative meeting, a council member muttered, half to himself, half to the clerk, that perhaps it was time to consider a statement, if only to prevent the tale from festering unchecked. Others nodded, though they expressed their agreement in the careful, measured way peculiar to small committees, aware that any official action might be interpreted as undue alarm. Purbright moved among the spaces of the town with his usual unobtrusive grace, listening more than speaking, noting more than revealing. He observed that the effect of the photograph was not so much in the image itself as in the way the town had chosen to interpret it. The human element, expectation, memory, fear of embarrassment, and the faint thrill of scandal, proved, as it often did, far more consequential than the photographic evidence. By evening, the quiet turmoil had settled into a low hum, a background buzz of speculation that permeated the streets, the parlour rooms, and the offices of Flaxborough. The photograph remained on display, framed and serene, yet it had already begun to shape the town's perceptions, hinting at mysteries where none had been suspected. Inspector Purbright returned to his rooms that night with the distinct impression that the day had revealed more about the citizens than about the man in the photograph. He sipped his solitary cup of tea, thoughtful and deliberate, aware that the puzzle before him would require patience, discretion, and careful attention to the subtle cues that ordinary people, polite and measured, seldom noticed about themselves. In Flaxborough, as in most places, it was not the overt disturbances that required scrutiny, but the quiet, almost invisible shifts in behaviour, opinion, and conversation. Purbright, quietly smiling at the faint chaos of ordinary minds, recognized that the photograph had achieved something extraordinary. It had made the town reveal itself. The morning after the exhibition found Inspector Purbright at the town hall once more, this time with a deliberate purpose that contrasted sharply with his previous, almost accidental presence. The photograph, still displayed in its modest frame, seemed to assert itself with a quiet insistence, demanding attention from all who passed. Purbright, as was his custom, approached the task with patience, noting that the answers he sought would emerge not through urgency, but through careful observation and polite, persistent questioning. He began with Mr. Darrow, the photographer, whose hands trembled faintly as he arranged his papers. "You maintain that this image is genuine?" Purbright said softly, nodding toward the group portrait. "Nothing added? Nothing removed?" Darrow's reply was immediate and firm, though tempered with the polite nervousness of a man aware that public perception could be as damning as any misdeed. "I assure you, Inspector, there has been no deception. The figure was present in the original exposure. I myself was unaware until development. And even then, well, I was taken aback." Purbright inclined his head, noting both the precision of Darrow's speech and the careful manner in which he avoided embellishment. The man's character, honest yet anxious, might have inclined him toward exaggeration if any opportunity existed, yet there was none here. The inspector made a subtle mental note to revisit this observation later. Next, Purbright visited the council chambers to speak with Mr. Hargreaves, a long-serving member whose interest in civic matters extended to meticulous control over minor affairs. Hargreaves displayed a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "A disturbance like this," he said, "should not be left to rumor. People see what they wish, and I fear the town will concoct theories that do not withstand scrutiny." Purbright observed the manner in which the councilman's hands folded, the slight tightening of his jaw, and the ever-so-brief hesitation before he continued. Even the most measured statements, the inspector knew, could conceal more than they revealed. From the tea-room he called upon Mrs. Talloway, who greeted him with a warmth tempered by unspoken urgency. Her recollections of the exhibition were precise, yet subtly coloured by her own sense of propriety. She described who stood where, how the figure appeared at the edge of the frame, and the hushed reactions of those nearby. Purbright, listening intently, noted not only her words but her pauses, the slight furrowing of her brow when she recounted minor disagreements among the onlookers, and the careful avoidance of any assertion beyond her personal observation. By midday he returned to the photograph itself, crouching slightly to inspect the composition. Details unnoticed by casual viewers now revealed themselves. A slight distortion at the edge of the frame, a shadow that did not align with the others, and, curiously, a faint reflection in the window behind the group that hinted at a presence not captured elsewhere. Such minutiae, the inspector understood, were often more revealing than the subject's apparent identity. Later, in a quiet corridor of the town hall, Purbright encountered a clerk who had assisted with the exhibition setup. The young man's account, hesitant and careful, introduced a minor contradiction. He remembered adjusting a small easel, but could not recall whether the final alignment matched his own arrangement. To anyone else this might have seemed trivial. To Purbright it was another thread, one that might eventually tie the strands of confusion into a coherent pattern. He paused then, allowing himself a quiet observation of human behavior. The town, he reflected, had already begun to shape the narrative. People believed what suited their inclinations, some seeking mystery, others reassurance, and a few simply the pleasure of being in possession of knowledge that no one else had. Each account, each minor exaggeration or omission, revealed as much about the storyteller as it did about the story itself. Returning to Mr. Darrow, Purbright asked about the technical process, questions phrased with courteous precision so as not to alarm or offend. Details of exposure, lighting, and development were provided with care. Yet the inspector detected a faint hesitation when the photographer recounted the precise moment the figure emerged on the negative. It was a hesitation so slight that a casual observer would have missed it entirely, but for Purbright it carried significance, a subtle invitation to probe further, quietly, in due course. By evening, the initial inquiries had laid a foundation of observations, contradictions, and partial truths. The inspector retreated to his rooms with a sense that the photograph's mystery was far from simple. Each person's account added nuance, each omission suggested hidden motives, and each subtle hesitation promised insight, should he be patient enough to watch and listen. Purbright poured himself a cup of tea and examined his notes. The day's inquiries had provided more questions than answers, yet he found satisfaction in the gradual assembly of the town's perceptions. He knew that truth in Flaxborough often revealed itself not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of details and the careful reading of human behavior. The photograph, benign and yet profoundly unsettling, would demand such patience, and he was more than willing to provide it. It was mid-morning when the subtle weight of suspicion settled upon Mr. Leonard Chiswell, the local historian, whose sudden reappearance in Flaxborough had coincided almost inconveniently with the exhibition of the photograph. Chiswell, a man of meticulous habits and a reputation for opportunistic curiosity, had returned ostensibly to sort archival material at the town hall. The coincidence did not escape the council members, nor the tea-room chatterers who prided themselves on observing civic minutiae. Purbright, however, observed quietly and without hurry. Chiswell's manners were impeccable, his tone measured, and yet there was a faint air of anticipation in his gait, as though he expected, perhaps even hoped, that someone might notice his return. The historian had the kind of presence that invited conjecture, precisely the sort of character the town might, in its haste, regard as culpable without evidence. A meeting of the town council convened shortly after the exhibition's ongoing stir reached its peak. Members exchanged glances, words chosen with deliberation, and, in the polite shadows of civility, Chiswell became the convenient focus of their concerns. "It is, of course, possible," one councilman ventured, "that Mr. Chiswell has a vested interest in this photograph's notoriety. We should remain alert." Purbright noted the careful selection of the phrase vested interest, a construction intended to imply suspicion without accusation, and smiled faintly at its subtle artistry. Chiswell himself remained outwardly calm. He offered no denial, yet neither did he volunteer information. When asked casually about the photograph, he spoke of his interest in historical accuracy, his fascination with period detail, and the importance of documenting the town's social memory. All perfectly reasonable, and yet the timing of his remarks, the gentle tightening of his hands on the council's agenda papers, and the near imperceptible rise in his voice when mentioning past local scandals suggested to Purbright that there was more beneath the surface. Later, as Purbright observed Chiswell in the town hall corridors, the historian paused by a filing cabinet, ostensibly searching for documents. The inspector noted the care with which Chiswell aligned the folders, the precision of his gestures, and the slight glance toward the photograph before returning to his task. These were small details, perhaps insignificant to an inattentive eye, but they contributed to an impression, a pattern that warranted patient consideration rather than immediate judgment. Meanwhile, the town itself had begun to align with the suspicion. Conversations in the butcher's shop and along the marketplace whispered of Chiswell's possible motives. "He's always sniffing about for a story," a shop assistant murmured, wringing her hands. "Perhaps he hopes to make some discovery that puts him in print?" Another customer nodded solemnly, adding that a man of such meticulous habits could surely manipulate circumstances without leaving obvious traces. Yet Purbright, for all the town's eagerness, withheld conclusion. He knew well the danger of allowing expectation to shape observation. A neat resolution, he reflected, was comforting but often misleading. Chiswell, though a convenient suspect, had so far provided no proof of wrongdoing, and the photograph itself remained enigmatic in ways that no opportunist could fully account for. In the afternoon, Purbright visited the exhibition once more, noting how Chiswell lingered near the photograph, seemingly absorbed yet careful not to draw attention. The historian's attention to detail, his courteous acknowledgments of passers-by, and his controlled responses suggested genuine interest rather than calculated mischief. Yet there remained the faintest aura of anticipation, a subtle eagerness to see how events unfolded. By evening, as the town's gossip settled into the usual low hum of speculation, the first outlines of a solution had formed in polite conversation. Chiswell as instigator, Darrow as unwitting accomplice, the photograph as a clever fabrication. The neatness of this explanation had appeal, and many found it sufficient without further inquiry. Purbright, seated at his desk with papers neatly arranged, allowed a quiet smile. The town was ready for closure, yet the truth, as he knew, often refused such simplicity. He reflected on the historian's presence and the town's eagerness to resolve discomfort with convenient narrative. Small inconsistencies, subtle hesitations, and the alignment of minor details would, he knew, eventually guide him toward the real explanation. For now, however, he allowed the polite illusion to persist, noting with dry amusement that Flaxborough, like many towns, preferred tidy answers, even when none existed. The inspector closed his notebook, careful not to disturb the silence of his room. Tomorrow, he thought, would offer new threads to follow, perhaps in places no one yet suspected. In the gentle glow of evening light, he sipped his tea and considered the town's impatience, confident that truth, though delayed, would be revealed in due course, and certainly not through the obvious suspect alone. It was during a routine perusal of the town hall archives that Purbright's attention was drawn to a small, unassuming envelope, yellowed with age and tucked carelessly between folders of council correspondence. Its presence was neither conspicuous nor particularly promising, yet something in the way it had been mislaid suggested that it might have been overlooked intentionally, or at least that it warranted inspection. The envelope bore no name, only a faint notation in a clerical hand, and its contents were minimal. A single photographic negative, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Purbright handled it with deliberate care, noting the faint fingerprint smudges along the edge of the tissue. The negative itself was innocuous, depicting a view of the town's square from months past, yet one detail caught his eye. A shadow at the periphery, faint but undeniably there, that did not correspond with any figure in the developed photograph. It was the sort of trivial discrepancy that a casual observer would dismiss, but Purbright, trained to read the language of subtle misalignments, found it immediately compelling. Returning to the photograph displayed at the exhibition, he compared the shadows and alignments, noting how the image captured by Mr. Darrow differed in orientation and detail from the negative. It was, on the surface, an insignificant technicality. The negative was slightly crooked, the lines of the paving stones askew, and yet these minor deviations created a ripple of curiosity within the mind of the inspector. How often, he reflected, did human error masquerade as anomaly, only to be mistaken for something more extraordinary? The envelope's existence alone, tucked in a place overlooked by council clerks and historians alike, suggested to him a quiet oversight rather than deliberate concealment. And yet, as he traced the edges of the negative, he noted that someone had handled it with care, aligning it with a faint precision that contrasted with its misplacement. Such contradictions, the inspector knew, were often more revealing than the dramatic gestures of guilt or alarm. By mid-morning, Purbright had summoned Mr. Darrow for a polite examination. The photographer observed the negative, initially perplexed, then curious. "I do not recall developing this," he said carefully, turning the fragile item in his hands. "It must have been from an earlier session, but the figure—" His voice trailed off, and Purbright noted the subtle narrowing of the eyes, the almost imperceptible hesitation before he continued. "It could be a coincidence, or perhaps someone else, an assistant, was involved, but I assure you, Inspector, I was not aware of it." Purbright's observations were deliberate, his questions measured. He did not press for immediate answers, recognizing that the smallest of reactions could provide more insight than the most elaborate interrogations. The negative, after all, was unremarkable in its clarity, its subject matter ordinary. Yet it contained, in its quiet presence, a disruption of expectation, an anomaly that was both slight and significant, trivial, yet impossible to ignore. Later, walking through the corridors of the town hall, Purbright reflected on the curious human tendency to overlook small details until they become critical. A mislaid envelope, a faint shadow, a subtle hesitation in speech, these were the instruments through which truths often revealed themselves more reliably than the sweeping statements of self-assured citizens. The town, he mused, had rushed toward Chiswell as an obvious suspect, yet it was these minute discrepancies that would, in time, provide a firmer foundation for understanding. By afternoon, he had returned to his rooms with the envelope safely stored, placing it beside his notes. He poured himself a cup of tea and considered the sequence of observations, Darrow's meticulous development, the shadow in the negative, the minor inconsistencies in alignment, all trivial yet persistently insistent. Small deviations, he knew, often contained the weight of larger truths waiting patiently for a discerning eye. Evening brought a quiet satisfaction. While the town prepared itself for another round of speculation over the obvious suspect, Purbright allowed his mind to linger on the envelope and its unremarkable negative. In their quiet, almost invisible way, they promised direction where gossip could not, offering threads to follow that were subtle, yet far more telling than the loud assertions of the impatient. The inspector sipped his tea and allowed a faint smile. Sometimes the smallest detail held the power to unmask the grandest of misperceptions. By the following morning, the subtle ripples caused by the photograph had grown into a quiet current, drawing into their orbit several new figures whose minor grievances and hidden habits might, in another context, have remained unremarked. Purbright, noting the widening pattern, chose to observe these developments before imposing his presence. His first call was to Mrs. Weatherby, the florist, whose shop window displayed not only blooms, but a careful arrangement of curiosities that often attracted the idle gaze of the town's residents. She spoke readily of the exhibition, emphasizing the intrigue it had caused, and hinted that her late husband, a minor official in the council, had once expressed concern over misplaced documents and overlooked shadows, remarks that now seemed curiously prescient. From there, Purbright ventured to the retired railway clerk, Mr. Pargeter, whose careful routine of daily walks and precise recollections of station arrivals and departures lent him an air of exactitude. Pargeter had observed the movements of certain townsfolk during the exhibition, and in his recollection noted that Chiswell had lingered longer than necessary, and that Darrow, though meticulous, had seemed distracted at intervals. Though the details were fragmentary, they added texture to the pattern Purbright was beginning to perceive, offering small contradictions to the neat narrative favoured by council members and tea-room chatterers alike. Later, a call to the minor aristocrat, Lady Carmichael, brought forth yet another perspective. She had attended the exhibition with her usual grace, and her remarks were laced with understated irony. "It is fascinating," she said, fingering the edge of her gloves, "how a single image can so swiftly disturb otherwise stable arrangements. It reminds one that appearances are not merely what they seem, they are, in truth, what people wish them to be." Purbright, noting the subtle inflection, stored the observation for later consideration. Lady Carmichael's insight, though politely couched, often carried weight beyond her social flourishes. By mid-afternoon, the inspector had mapped a broader field of personalities and motives, each overlapping with the others in faint, almost invisible lines. The florist, sensitive to civic pride and the potential for scandal. The railway clerk, dedicated to precise recollection, yet susceptible to interpretive bias. The minor aristocrat, inclined toward observation and subtle commentary. Together they formed a lattice through which human foibles and social ambition could be traced. In a quiet moment, Purbright returned to the photograph, studying its composition against the memory of the negative from the mislaid envelope. The contrasts, shadows, and minor discrepancies remained. Each new account he had gathered added context, a series of intersecting possibilities that widened the circle of inquiry far beyond the first obvious suspect. The narrative he had been following with such polite restraint now demanded accommodation of complexity, a recognition that the photograph's appearance might engage more than one set of human motives and misunderstandings. By evening, the town itself reflected this expansion of interest. In the general store, patrons debated whether the figure in the photograph had been genuinely present or merely a coincidence of angle and shadow. In the tea room, Mrs. Talloway and her colleagues speculated on minor rivalries that might have prompted someone to manipulate perception, while the council members considered, in careful tones, the need for additional oversight. Even the younger townsfolk, previously content with whispered tales of resurrection, began to notice the subtler patterns, who lingered near the exhibition, whose attention faltered, whose enthusiasm seemed unusually timed. Purbright, observing all of this with his usual calm, noted that human nature, in its manifold quirks, rarely offered straightforward evidence. Instead, it provided hints, contradictions, and fleeting admissions that, when patiently assembled, revealed far more than dramatic statements or direct confessions ever could. The growing network of minor grievances, subtle ambitions, and unnoticed habits, he realized, was far more significant than the immediate puzzle of the photograph. As night fell, he returned to his quarters, reviewing his notes and arranging them alongside the observations of the previous days. The broader field, now populated with multiple perspectives and potential motives, promised a complex unraveling that would require the quiet patience and attention to human behavior for which Flaxborough's residents, in their social preoccupations, were all too willing to provide. The photograph had begun as a curiosity, but it was quickly proving a catalyst for revealing the town itself, and Purbright, with a gentle smile, anticipated the subtleties yet to come. The following week introduced a new, unsettling development that quietly shifted the tenor of the inquiry. A photograph appeared in the window of the local antique shop, seemingly ordinary in size and framing, yet its content caused a ripple of incredulity among those who glimpsed it. The image depicted a small gathering outside the town hall, a scene taken some weeks prior, and yet unmistakably included the same figure from the exhibition, the man long believed dead. Its presence, this time among an entirely different group and context, rendered previous assumptions increasingly untenable. Purbright, summoned by the shopkeeper under the guise of civic curiosity, examined the photograph with calm attentiveness. The composition was straightforward, the lighting consistent with natural daylight, and no apparent sign of manipulation could be discerned without closer scrutiny. Yet the figure's appearance in this separate context was inexplicable. The inspector allowed himself the faintest smile at the town's likely reaction. Speculation would now multiply, and the neat resolution that had begun to form around Chiswell was immediately destabilized. As he stepped back to observe the window display, he noted the reactions of passers-by. Mrs. Talloway, consulting her notebook as she passed, paused, tapped her chin, and murmured to a companion about the impossibility of the scene. The retired railway clerk, Mr. Pargeter, lingered near the curb, adjusting his spectacles as though to ensure his vision had not betrayed him. Even Lady Carmichael, from a discreet distance, inclined her head with the faintest expression of wry amusement, as if acknowledging the delicate absurdity of the situation. Within the town hall, the council convened with an air of polite urgency. Chiswell, summoned to explain the apparent anomaly, offered courteous statements about archival coincidences and the occasional unpredictability of photographic documentation. His explanations, precise and measured, were met with polite skepticism, though the underlying disquiet was evident. The photograph in the shop window had introduced a complication that no careful account could easily resolve. Purbright, for his part, focused on the human reactions rather than the photograph itself. The subtle hesitations in speech, the flickers of recognition, and the faint shifts of posture each revealed something about those who had previously seemed confident in their interpretations. The town's eagerness for a tidy solution was now confronted with ambiguity, and the inspector observed how quickly certainty could be replaced by tentative conjecture. By afternoon, the story had filtered through the tea-room, the bookshop, and the florist's parlour. Conversations shifted in tone. No longer were citizens merely curious or suspicious of Chiswell alone. They speculated about the possibility of deliberate deception, misremembered events, or even the faintly supernatural. Each retelling, as it passed through the layers of polite society, introduced minor variations that Purbright catalogued with meticulous care. The pattern of human behavior, he noted, was now as significant as any technical anomaly captured on film. The second photograph also prompted a subtle reassessment among Mr. Darrow and his associates. The photographer examined his own work, comparing dates, angles, and shadows, yet found no evidence of duplication or trickery. The technical details offered no resolution. The enigma persisted, shifting the focus from the first obvious suspect to the wider circumstances of the town itself. By evening, the sense of complexity had deepened. The neat narrative that had once centered on Chiswell was now clearly insufficient. The photograph's repeated appearance introduced doubt and demanded broader consideration of human error, coincidental alignment, and the hidden nuances of perception. For Purbright, the incident was both a challenge and a reassurance. The unfolding mystery required patience, observation, and careful attention to subtle human motives, all elements that would ultimately reveal more than any immediate evidence could. The town, meanwhile, continued its routines, yet the photograph's presence lingered in conversation, in speculative glances, and in the quiet reconsideration of prior assumptions. The inspector, retiring to his study with a cup of tea and his notes spread before him, allowed himself a faint smile. Complexity had replaced convenience, ambiguity had displaced certainty, and the true work of observation, the patient assembling of details and the reading of human behavior, had begun in earnest. That evening, Purbright walked the quiet streets of Flaxborough, the soft glow of gas lamps casting gentle shadows over cobbled pavements and shop fronts shuttered against the encroaching night. The town, outwardly unchanged, now carried in its subtle rhythms the after-effects of the photograph and its uncanny recurrence. Observing passers-by, he noted the slight quickening of pace, the furtive glances toward the exhibition, and the occasional whisper that dissolved as he approached. Human nature, he reflected, was an intricate landscape, far more revealing than any single image could ever hope to capture. Returning to his study, he reviewed his notes in silence, arranging the sequence of observations, statements, and anomalies into the lattice of events that had gradually formed over the past days. The first obvious suspect, Chiswell, remained a figure of interest, yet the second incident and the mislaid negative complicated the narrative. It was not enough to consider who might have orchestrated a hoax. Rather, Purbright sought to understand why the town itself had been drawn into constructing patterns where none might have existed. He pondered the small but telling gestures that had accumulated, the faint hesitation in Darrow's tone, Mrs. Talloway's emphatic insistence on identity, Pargeter's meticulous recollection, and Lady Carmichael's subtle, knowing observations. Each revealed an aspect of character, a social predilection, or a minor vanity that, when woven together, began to illuminate the subtle forces that guided behavior in this tightly knit community. It was in these private reflections, he knew, that the true nature of the mystery would slowly come into focus. Purbright considered memory itself, with its propensity for distortion and selective recall. The human mind, he mused, often sought narrative coherence, even at the expense of truth. The photograph, innocuous and persistent, had acted as a catalyst, revealing not only the town's curiosity, but also its desire to impose order on uncertainty. In this, he found both amusement and insight. The anomaly was less remarkable than the reactions it elicited, yet no less informative for the task at hand. He traced the chronology in his mind, the exhibition, the first appearance of the figure, the mislaid negative, Chiswell's presence, and the second photograph in the shop window. Each event, he noted, offered minor contradictions, hesitations, and overlaps that would later prove crucial. The puzzle, though superficially simple, demanded careful attention to the interplay of observation and perception, timing and subtle motive. There was no rush. Flaxborough itself seemed to unfold at the precise pace required for comprehension. By late evening, Purbright's attention shifted to human interaction, particularly the quiet undercurrents of politeness that often masked true feeling. Conversations at the tea-room, council chambers, and shops, while outwardly civil, were suffused with tension, small deceptions, and social manoeuvring. The inspector reflected on how reputations, minor rivalries, and personal pride shaped responses, turning simple observations into fertile ground for misunderstanding or embellishment. The photograph, he concluded, was as much a mirror of the town's character as a record of events. He made careful notes for the following day, intending to observe reactions to both the exhibition and the shop window display with renewed attentiveness. The pattern, he sensed, was emerging gradually, not through dramatic confrontation or sudden revelation, but through the accumulation of minor details and the careful reading of human behavior. Each small inconsistency, pause, and hesitation contributed to a mosaic that, once fully appreciated, would yield clarity. As he prepared for rest, Purbright allowed himself a faint smile at the thought of the quiet theatre in which the town participated. The photograph remained central, yet the story was as much about human nature as it was about any anomaly captured on film. Patience, observation, and reflection, he knew, would reveal the truth in due course, and nothing more dramatic or obvious would suffice. Flaxborough, in its ordinary rhythms and minor peculiarities, had laid bare the very threads that he would follow, with careful, unhurried attention. The following morning, Purbright arranged for a seemingly casual meeting at the town hall, carefully timed to coincide with a visit by several key figures. The photograph remained on display, and he ensured that Mr. Chiswell, Mr. Darrow, and Mrs. Talloway would all be present, each believing the gathering to be a matter of routine discussion about archival organization and exhibition upkeep. The inspector, as always, conducted himself with polite composure, his tone courteous and unassuming, masking the precise intent behind his questions and remarks. He began with neutral conversation, asking about minor details of the exhibition's setup, the placement of panels, and the ordering of photographs. Chiswell, attentive and precise, responded with careful exactitude, providing more information than was strictly necessary. Purbright allowed the responses to flow, observing closely the subtle variations in tone, hesitation, and phrasing. Darrow, polite and cooperative, offered his own recollections with the meticulousness of a man trained to see and record detail, yet the smallest flicker of surprise crossed his features when certain dates and exposures were mentioned. Then, with the most unremarkable of transitions, Purbright spoke of the photograph in the shop window, asking casually if anyone had noted minor discrepancies between the images. The remark, delivered with gentle detachment, was intended less as a question than as a stimulus for observation. Chiswell's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly, and Darrow shifted in his chair, careful not to betray discomfort. Mrs. Talloway's eyes widened fractionally, though she masked her reaction with a polite inquiry about the technicalities of exposure. Purbright allowed the pause to linger, providing no follow-up, no insistence, merely maintaining his composed silence. The effect was subtle, yet deliberate. Each person was forced to confront the implications of his statement in private thought, and their responses, expressed in micro-reactions rather than words, revealed inconsistencies and minor evasions. The historian's habitual precision faltered just enough to be observed. The photographer's confidence exhibited a faint tremor, and Mrs. Talloway's certainty wavered in the smallest degree. He followed this with a gentle reference to the mislaid negative found in the archive, asking casually if anyone recalled unusual handling of archival materials. The question, framed as polite curiosity, elicited a faint exchange of glances between Chiswell and Darrow, unspoken communication that carried the weight of implication. Purbright did not press. He merely allowed the moment to register, noting the subtle reactions, the delicate hints of internal calculation, and the quiet adjustments of posture and expression that betrayed thought processes otherwise hidden behind words of civility. By afternoon, it was clear to the inspector that the test had yielded insight beyond any direct questioning. The reactions, almost imperceptible to a casual observer, had drawn forth nuances of behavior, hesitation, and alignment of interest that pointed to the true locus of the anomaly. Purbright did not yet speak, for the moment required patience. The town's eagerness for resolution would not dictate the pace of discovery. In the quiet hours of observation, he recorded these minute reactions alongside previous notes, assembling a pattern that was not evident in statements alone, but in the orchestration of human behavior across settings and time. The test, gentle and courteous, had allowed him to see the subtle fissures in otherwise composed appearances, revealing the unspoken connections that no direct inquiry could elicit. By evening, as the town resumed its usual rhythm, Purbright reflected on the delicate efficacy of his approach. There had been no confrontation, no overt accusation, yet the results were unmistakable. The guilty awareness concealed beneath the polite mask of civility had been revealed in microcosm. The photograph, the negative, the recurring appearances, and the pattern of human reaction were now aligned in a manner that would permit the final elucidation of truth when the time came. The inspector, reclining in his study with a cup of tea, allowed himself a faint smile. The test had not forced confession, but it had drawn out the subtle indicators he required. Patience, discretion, and observation, these, as always, were the instruments through which clarity emerged, and Purbright felt confident that the next stage of the inquiry would bring resolution without fanfare, only the quiet, precise revelation that Flaxborough demanded. The following afternoon, Purbright arranged for a quiet gathering at the photography club, a setting familiar and non-threatening where all involved, the historian, the photographer, and a selection of the town's curious onlookers, could convene without alarm. The room was arranged with measured symmetry, the photographs displayed, chairs aligned, and the warm light from the windows softened by curtains, lending an air of calm civility to the proceedings. Purbright, as always, entered with unobtrusive authority, his expression composed, his manner courteous, yet subtly anticipatory. He began with a general discussion of the exhibition, speaking of the town's pride in documenting its civic life, the care required in developing images, and the occasional anomalies that arose from technical or human error. His voice carried an understated charm, the kind that invited cooperation rather than resistance. The subjects of the gathering responded politely, yet there was an undercurrent of curiosity, a tension that hinted at awareness of unspoken matters. Gently, Purbright shifted the focus to the mislaid negative. He recounted its discovery in the archives, emphasizing the trivial nature of its placement, yet the subtle discrepancies it contained. The historian's brows knitted slightly, and Darrow's hands, resting on his knees, shifted ever so slightly. Purbright observed without comment, noting the almost imperceptible reactions that revealed the depth of attention each had paid to the minor irregularities. Then, with deliberate calm, he addressed the recurring figure. The photograph in the exhibition, the negative, the image in the shop window, all were laid before the gathering. "There is, of course, nothing supernatural here," Purbright said, his tone measured, "and no one has been misleading the town intentionally. The anomaly arises quite simply from the interaction of human oversight, timing, and the quirks of early photographic processes." He paused, allowing the words to settle, and watched as the subtle weight of comprehension began to register. Purbright continued, tracing the chain of events, how the initial photograph captured a shadow that coincidentally resembled the long-deceased Mr. Aldridge, how the negative had been handled differently, producing slight variations, and how subsequent development and display compounded the illusion. Each step was presented with calm clarity, the logic unfolding naturally without dramatization, yet with precise linkage that left no contradiction unaddressed. He then acknowledged the human element, the eagerness of the town to detect patterns, the tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with expectation, and the influence of subtle social rivalries and pride. Chiswell's attentiveness, Darrow's meticulous development, and Mrs. Talloway's certainties were all perfectly rational within this context. Their reactions were consistent with the nature of the town and the minor confusion of perception. No deceit, no fraud, no deliberate manipulation, only the natural unfolding of error, coincidence, and interpretation. As Purbright spoke, he allowed his audience moments to reflect, gently connecting each anomaly to its cause, each hesitation to its understandable motivation. There was no grand flourish, no accusation, only the quiet resolution of a problem that had, in its subtleties, engaged an entire community. The town's curiosity, its gossip, and its eagerness for explanation were acknowledged with courtesy. Yet the photograph's secret was now fully accounted for, reconciled within the framework of ordinary human behavior. By the time he concluded, the expressions of those present had shifted from perplexity to quiet understanding. Chiswell nodded in measured acknowledgement, Darrow relaxed, and even Mrs. Talloway allowed herself a polite smile. The town's intrigue, while entertained, had been met with reasoned clarity. Purbright, observing the collective calm, felt the familiar satisfaction of resolution achieved without spectacle, a quiet triumph in the patient application of observation and discretion. The photograph, once a source of whispered speculation and mild alarm, had become a lesson in perception, timing, and the subtle influence of human nature. The anomalies remained visible, yet their meaning was clear, and the town, having witnessed the explanation, could return to its routines with a renewed understanding of the ordinary intricacies that had caused extraordinary speculation. As the gathering dispersed, Purbright lingered briefly to ensure the proper arrangement of the photographs, then returned to his study. The sequence of observation, patient inquiry, and gentle testing had yielded clarity, the intricate puzzle reduced to simple, rational explanation. Flaxborough, in its ordinary rhythms, had revealed its character, and the photograph, once so mysterious, had quietly fulfilled its unintended role in exposing the town's subtle patterns of expectation, error, and interpretation. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled once more into its familiar rhythms, though subtle traces of the recent intrigue lingered like a faint undertone beneath ordinary life. The photograph, now understood and explained, had lost none of its visual clarity but had gained the quiet dignity of resolved curiosity. Conversations in the tea-room and bookshop returned to everyday matters, appointments, deliveries, the occasional complaint about weather, yet the polite awareness of recent events had left a gentle mark on many of the townsfolk. Mrs. Talloway, arranging her ledger and teacups, occasionally glanced toward the window, where her memory of the photograph had once sparked fervent speculation. She smiled faintly, acknowledging in her own way the subtle lesson it had imparted about perception, expectation, and the human tendency to amplify coincidence. Mr. Slater, sipping tea and adjusting his spectacles, reflected quietly on the cautionary value of premature judgment, finding a small satisfaction in the measured truth that had quietly prevailed. At the town hall, Mr. Darrow attended to minor exhibitions and clerical matters, his meticulous care undiminished, yet now tempered by the knowledge that even ordinary composition could inspire extraordinary speculation. Chiswell, the historian, resumed his archival work, precise as ever, though he occasionally paused, casting a discreet glance toward the now unremarkable photographs, perhaps acknowledging the gentle lesson of the town's eagerness for tidy narratives. Purbright, seated in his study with a neatly arranged stack of papers, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The progression of events, the initial anomaly, the town's reactions, the subtle discrepancies, the accumulation of observations, and the careful orchestration of his test had confirmed the quiet truths he so often relied upon. The puzzle had resolved not through confrontation, spectacle, or dramatic confession, but through patient attention to human behavior, small inconsistencies, and the interplay of observation and discretion. He noted with dry amusement how the town had unconsciously revealed its own character, every minor hesitation, subtle exaggeration, and polite embellishment contributing to a mosaic that,